Africa is losing billions of dollars due to biased coverage by mainstream Western media outlets that are obsessive about portraying the continent negatively. So what are African countries doing to counter this toxic Western agenda? For more on how Western media stereotypes on Africa are impacting negatively on the continent, we have contacted Hassan Loget. He is the co-founder of Media Justice Africa. Also joining us to discuss this subject is Khalid Alawode. He is the Deputy Speaker of Faculty of Social Sciences Student Parliament at Ahmadu Bello University, Kaduna State in Nigeria. A new study has revealed how African nations could be losing up to $4.2 billion annually on debt servicing alone as their risk profiles increase, driven by stereotypes perpetuated by mainstream Western news media. According to this study by Africa No Filter Lobby Group, the losses occasioned by negative media coverage annually could fund the education of 12 million African children and provide immunization to over 73 million children. There is now an urgent need to resist the stereotypes about the continent advanced by Western media, rooted in racism and hegemonic attitudes. Now, are African governments paying enough attention to the issues of biased media coverage that is negatively impacting the continent?
Media stereotypes affecting Africa. European and American mainstream media outlets generally perceive Africa through stereotypes and myths. An analysis of Western news media shows that structural biases and operational frameworks continue to perpetuate negative perceptions of Africa and its people.
These imperialist media outlets mainly concentrate on reporting crisis news on Africa and tend to discredit or ignore positive news from the continent. The Director General of Tanzania Broadcasting Corporation, Dr. Ayub Rioba, speaks here on how the mainstream Western media distorts the image of Africa.
I try to flip through the channels to find out, am I likely to see Africa? And believe you me, I would be surprised that the only time I would see Africa would be if there's war, if there's calamity, if there's something negative happening in Africa, which would be reported in a very demeaning way.
The report titled The Cost of Media Stereotypes to Africa said that African countries may be losing as much as $4.2 billion every year just on paying off their debts due to rising risk levels influenced by stereotypes portrayed in the media. Now, this is a substantial amount of money for Africa. Our first question goes to Hassan Loget. Now, why are mainstream Western media outlets bent on portraying Africa negatively?
This is a colonial media construct. It is something that is rooted in colonialism, where when the colonialists came into our countries, they destroyed our indigenous cultures, our ways of doing work, the ways of doing trade, and they basically wanted to export our raw materials, something that is again on the agenda. So the idea is that we had to become consumers of processed goods in Europe, in particular, or now with the United States, the global north, if you like. So when they give a narrow and negative image of Africa, they are merely explaining the dominant power relations. They want us to kind of stay subservient, and they do not love the idea that we're seeking alliances. We want to assert our own agendas. But if you look at this figure, in pounds, it's 3.2 billion pounds, okay? Now, they've managed to quantify the losses we suffer as a people for negative coverage. But that is only a rehabilitation in terms of money. The rehabilitation in terms of the restitution of who we are as human beings means that we must have the right to take our own decisions. We must choose whether we want to be friends with Iran or Russia or whoever on the basis of common human decency and common interests.
This report on the losses incurred by Africa due to biased media coverage also noted that the mainstream Western media stereotyped Africa's cultures, economies, and political systems, and often reported through a Western lens, leading to misinterpretations.
It appears that the imperialist powers, through their media outlets, are hell-bent on ensuring that Africa remains poor and dependent on them. Let's now bring in Khalid Alawode. What, in your opinion, could be the factor behind this negative media coverage?
My opinion concerning the negative coverage, like it stated earlier in the question, probably to actually ensure that the African remain poor. But beyond that, there are actually a lot of reasons, some other reasons, and all those reasons actually hinge on the fact that they want us to be dependent on them. When you look at the historical, like the colonialism, how the colonialism project started, we see that they tried to use the media to project us as backward, the Africans as backward, as uncivilized, and they use the media to actually justify the fact that they are civilized people, you understand, and they want to make sure that the Africans are civilized. And the negative coverage actually helps in ensuring that they are able to do whatever thing they want to do in terms of economic exploitation and the like that. So, like you said, just to make African poor, first of all, to actually ensure that they actually exploit us more, because we know that that's what they want to come and do, to actually exploit Africans, but for a good PR strategy to justify their own coming to Africa to do whatever thing they do, they need the media coverage. And that is why they keep portraying Africa with negative stereotypes now to justify their exploitative adventure like that.
The researchers writing the report on the cost of media stereotypes to Africa analyzed reporting during election cycles and found that although negative events are common during elections globally, African nations get more negative coverage during these periods, and that the language used is highly emotive and often includes words like rigging and corruption. A case in point is the report spreading across the social media that Starlink, Elon Musk's satellite-based internet service provider, helped in rigging the recent US presidential election. Such reports are suppressed in mainstream Western media news. It's quite obvious that imperialist news outlets apply double standards when reporting on Africa. Mr. Loggett, what's your take on this viewpoint?
Again, it follows the colonial pattern that they're to paint Africa as dark and ignorant, the dark continent, they used to talk about it. So in their study, the cost of media stereotypes to Africa study, they focused on Kenya, Nigeria, South Africa, and Egypt. It's interesting, in Mozambique, next door to us, 3 hours from where I'm sitting now, an election there, the opposition claims has been rigged. But there's silence from Western powers. You know why? They want the oil and the gas in the north of Mozambique. And the communities there have resisted, and then to get attention, they've called that a Muslim insurgency. Now this selectivity, right, of when they support, it's not as a principle that they always run Africa down. When it suits them, they do not run Africa down. There's a case in point with Mozambique, as I've just pointed out. Now, often, they set themselves up as the arbiters of free speech and civil and political rights. So you would find them being free around whom they can insult and whom they can't insult. But recently there was a football match in Amsterdam, and the media got it wrong. It's the first time they spoke about Arabs and Jews, right? Because they went into hiding for the past year after the massacres and the genocide in Palestine. They didn't say anything. But when they did speak now, they called it a pogrom. They called a pogrom. Not one person died in this football match, but they called it a pogrom. They call it Kristallnacht. It's reminiscent of the time when the Nazis were killing Jews. Nothing of that was true, because even the footage was wrong. A progressive Dutch journalist basically said, "This is my footage. You are misrepresenting it."
The other challenge is the enemy within. Africa is not being fairly represented to its own journalists. According to a report by Africa No Filter, more than 50% of the African editors had negative stereotypes of the stories and events happening on the continent. There is a wrong perception among journalists in Africa that positive news is no news, but negative news is news.
What we need to understand is that these guys, they actually gave us a curriculum. They injected in us their values, which we actually accept and we treat it as. The repercussion of this is very, very natural in the sense that we begin to see things through their lens, like see how event happens, explain how event happens through the lens of whatever things they've given us, the legacy they left behind. Now, when you look at the education system is actually structured based on what the Western people has actually what the Western people have laid down to us. And same thing, the curriculum, for those that want to study journalism and everything, these courses are actually based on how the Western people has actually left it to us. They taught us about the fact that bad news is news, good news is not news. They taught us about the fact that when a man bites dog, that is news. But when dog bites man, that is not news. These are things that they actually left for us, and we actually accepted those things without a kind of critically thinking whether these things are really our own African values.
The full impact of media bias extends beyond debt costs and likely affects other sectors like tourism and foreign direct investment. Now, Mr. Logat, are African governments pay enough attention to the issue of biased media coverage impacting negatively on the continent?
We shouldn't be too worried about getting people to come here. That the trade and that can be with our neighbors. Africa has got all the resources, the critical raw materials that we need to propel us into a clean green energy movement and society is all in Africa, right? And everyone is coming here to make partnerships with us, and they want to keep this relationship of inequity in place so that we can continue to sell them raw materials and buy the finished products. That is the colonial model, and that's what the media makes sure we keep staying like that. But as you point out in your interview here, there's resistance to that. Press TV, RT, we don't have to agree with all these, but these are alternative voices, which when we have to read the media to understand what's happening to the world, we've got to read them all.
Thanks, Mr. Logat, for that. Let's now take a short break before we continue our topic on how stereotypes perpetrated by Western media outlets are messing Africa's economy and efforts by African countries to confront these negative portrayals. Stay with us.
Action against biased coverage.
Western media outlets deliberately focus on conflict, poverty and corruption in Africa while neglecting positive news from the continent. However, there should also be commitment on the part of the African news media to properly represent the continent and avoid falling into the trap of biased Western media entities. Several countries in the continent are taking action to be in charge of disseminating information according to the interests of Africa. The Alliance of Sahel States, bringing together Burkina Faso, Mali and Niger, is set to launch a web television to fight in the information war after several Western and particularly French media outlets were ordered to leave the region due to negative reporting. The web TV will be part of a broader strategy aimed at strengthening the credibility of this anti-imperialist alliance on the international scene. For Africa to achieve economic growth, it must combat the negative image created by mainstream Western news media and change how it is depicted and understood. So will African governments and the private sector increase investment in the news media to tell their own narrative to the world?
Violence is seldom mentioned in news coverage of Western countries, but is often highlighted in coverage of African countries by mainstream Western news media. Additionally, articles discussing African countries tend to express more negative sentiment than those discussing Europe and America. For instance, many Ethiopians have long-standing suspicion of the West's intentions towards the country and see the media bias as a confirmation of such views.
Ethiopian demonstrators are seen here blaming mainstream Western media outlets for spreading fake news during the Tigray war in the country.
These things happened the past 3 years, you know. We've been trying to solve out the things in back home, but still he trying. Our Prime Minister, Dr. Abiy, he trying himself. But the thing is, the other opponent party, the TPLF, they don't want the leadership that he's running. And then they start to doing, they get support from US actually. They get truly support from US because the overseas news, is the parties which is passing through CNN, BBC, the fake news that they produce for us. And we're just going to be, the war in back home is still going on because of them.
The authorities in Mali, Niger and Burkina Faso are investigating a French journalist and researcher Wassim Nasser for his reports that are seen as apologetic towards terrorism and complicity in terrorist acts. Now, this is the latest action against biased Western media outlets. It appears African countries are finally taking action to counter negative coverage by mainstream Western media outlets. Now, Mr. Alawode, will such action have the desired impact?
It might actually achieve some desired impact. However, one thing we need to understand is the fact that banning foreign media is never enough for African government or for Africans in general to actually push their narrative out there. One thing we need to understand is that we human, we cannot be idle. We need to watch something, we need to listen to something. When we ban foreign media, one thing we need to do is to also encourage the growth of alternative media, homegrown media, government media, and we should ensure that we give them the support, the African government give them the support that they need to ensure that they're able to work properly and push the African narrative further beyond expectation. But one thing we also need to understand is the fact that for this to actually achieve some kind of desired change or to desired impact, the environment, the society needs to be reorganized. Because we have a situation whereby, we ban Western media, and we create our own media. And the journalists we are employing are actually our own journalists who are being trained based on Western values, based on Western way of seeing journalism. What is going to happen? Those guys will actually be doing will actually be replicating or will actually be perpetrating the same thing the Western media are also perpetrating. So the environment, the society needs to be organized in such a way that people are instilled with the right African value.
The West African countries of Burkina Faso and Niger have banned a French TV show for stigmatizing African women as well as being contrary to the values and customs of the two nations. Canal Plus was ordered to stop the broadcast of Season 3 of the series The Bachelor in these countries.
Western media outlets are not only reporting negatively on Africa, but also imposing corrupt Western values. Now, this for Mr. Loget, should other African countries emulate the action taken by these three Sahel countries?
We are talking about the Sahel countries, okay? And it's interesting that our whole discussion is focused around coloniality and decolonialism. That the French colonies, the former French colonies, are only now truly decolonizing, right? And they have thrown off French rule because they had an open letter these rulers had to invite military intervention by France. So this is why they are now taking a critical action against France. They begin to look how they don't have to use the CFA, the French franc only. They only use their own currencies. They're looking at how to assert their own identities. They've got incredible power and traditions of religion and Islam and culture, which other countries don't have. Their music is brilliant, right? They are beginning to assert it. But while France helped popularize it, they made it as a relic. They tried to choose this. This is what beautiful Africans can dance. But these people in these countries are trying to assert an identity that is their own, something that colonialism tried to stop.
The newly formed alliance of Sahel states, bringing together Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, is faced with disinformation campaigns. French and other Western mainstream media outlets have been banned in these countries for engaging in subversive activities aimed at overthrowing the popular anti-imperialist governments in the 3 Sahel states. These Sahel nations are set to launch a web television to confront Western media outlets in the ever-expanding information war. There is optimism that this move will bring about the desired change in the region and beyond.
Actually, I'm optimistic about the fact that some desired change is going to be achieved. Yeah, but however, when you look at it based on long-term goal, you can see that I'm more concerned about the sustainability of the project itself. Because as we've seen the other time, like for a very long time, they still will continue to testify about the fact that African governments have tried, some African governments have tried to establish national news agency among some other state media houses to actually to push or to bring a counter narrative. But at some point in time, those things failed. Understand? They might still be operating, but they actually failed to achieve their strategic goal. So, like I said the other time, for it to actually come to be very achieved, for it to be achieved, what we need to understand, like I said the other time, is what make sure that what the whole society is organized in terms of how people view journalism, how people practice journalism, so that people that are actually employed in those media houses established by the government, by the Sahel states, alliance of Sahel states, they will be able to see things through based on what African perspective.
There is no doubt that mainstream Western media outlets often highlight conflict, poverty, and corruption in Africa. But there is much more to the continent than the Western media portrays. On the other hand, African media outlets must also positively portray the continent. Good news should not be seen as merely government PR, but as a fact that needs to be reported and highlighted by private media outlets in Africa. Mr. Loga, do you agree with this?
Our national broadcaster has reported far better than the private broadcasters here in our country. At least if you look at Gaza and the genocide that's been unfolding. But even in our country, you may find people not even supporting the actions of our government at the ICJ, for example. But this is because every time our news items are on, they will use a feed from the BBC, more likely, or in preference to Press TV or somewhere else, or Al Jazeera, which is more mainstream. And this is a problem. We need to have a greater confidence to use other sources of information on global matters and not only rely on colonial masters, BBC. So that is one particular problem. I think that the African Union must have its own news channels so that African views must be there. And I agree, this must not be a mouthpiece, a propaganda mouthpiece.
No doubt good journalism requires investment. That investment in manpower and the industry as a whole requires a large financial input. We rarely see African media outlets with bureaus outside the continent. Khalid Alawade will have the last word. Now, are African governments investing enough in the media to tell their own narrative to the world?
To be very honest, I don't think the African governments are actually investing enough to actually push the African narrative based on a lot of reasons. First of all, the fact that when you look at the budgets given to the media houses and the kind of support the government are giving to private establishments, you also see that they are not enough at all. The salaries they are paying the media staff to actually motivate them more, it is actually very, very small, among other challenges that actually that makes it so evident that the governments will care, African governments careless about investing in media operations in their homegrown media. Another thing I actually see, one of the reasons I see that made me to actually make the judgment that African governments are not investing enough is the fact that there's no league, like they don't have global offices like in different parts of the world.
Well, it's quite clear that African governments need to invest more in the media to be able to present the correct African narrative to the world and thus counter the Western corporate media propaganda against the continent. I'd like to thank our guests today, Hassan Loget and Khalid Alawade, for their insight.